Testing, 1, 2. Alrighty. Nice. Let's go and share my screen. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Tree. I'll be your host today. We are going to be continuing our DayZ scripting installment. And we took a 2-week break mainly because I had family in town and then I had to do some adulting stuff last week, but we're still continuing this. And today we're going to focus on a topic that a lot of people ask about and feel like it's kind of difficult or out of reach. And I'm here to show that it's not really the case and it's actually a lot easier than you would expect. So that topic is animations. And what I mean by animations in this case, we're talking about rigid bones. So things that are not bendy. So that's what I mean by rigid. Think of like a stick or a metal rod. And those metal rods have like a beginning and an end. And in this case, I'll start referring to them as bones because that's kind of what they translate to. And so bones usually have a beginning and an end. They will connect to something, and you could have multiple bones connected to multiple other bones. Like think of your hand. You have your pinky is 3 individual bones connected in a line, one after the other, and then that bottom bone is sort of connected to the palm. And you can move them all independently, but they all move relative to the other. And so from this notion, we basically build inverse kinematics from that notion, but I'm not going to go into like what that means. But anytime you see in DayZ files like the IK animation, they're referring to inverse kinematics, and you should Google that word, inverse kinematics, and read a little bit about it. But it's the idea of animations here with DayZ is that we have a couple bones, we can connect them to each other, we can tell the bone to move, or I'll use the word translate because it can move in the X, Y, Z direction, up, down, left, right, forward, backwards. It can rotate around an axis, and then it can also scale, but like get bigger or smaller. And those are kind of the animations, and I say that in air quotes, that are available to us. And so with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into that and make our own animation. So I'm going to start DayZ tools. And today we're going to do something different. We're not going to work in my test mod like I have been in a while. I've been working on this other project, and so you're going to kind of see some live code that I'm actively deving. Okay, in order to... There's some requirements that you need to do an animation. First off, you need a P3D. You need an object that you're actually going to be doing animation on. And so what we have here is my P3D. It's a wall console that has a couple buttons that I want to be able to flip on and off, and has a dial that I want to be able to turn. And so currently, turn down this music. I'm going to open up my bulldozer. You can kind of see what we have so that there's a frame of reference. Is it starting up? There we go. Nice thing about Bulldozer is that it allows you to view P3Ds before they're in the game. So at a relatively low fidelity or resolution. So you don't have to like have a full mod packed to see the thing. And so this is kind of what we're looking at. It's a wall console. You can see the couple buttons there. And in Bulldozer, you can press the left and right brackets to cycle through animations, but you can see the little black box in the top left that's popping up here. But for some reason, it doesn't always work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that I want to show you our end goal, what we're wanting to get to. I'm going to do a really quick hack here and change the source of the animation to time so that it's always running, essentially. Just to kind of show you what we're expecting to see. Always nice to have a goal or result in mind. I can a hypothesis, mind you, before you actually do an experiment to validate a result and form a conclusion. So as you can see, The animations here are moving up and down, which is what you would expect for flipping a switch on and off, and the dial rotating around the z-axis, the front, forward, backward axis. So let's talk about what is required to get something like this working, okay? Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up a documentation from Daisy themselves, Daisy model config. Because if you haven't seen this, it's very important. It's basically the documentation on why the model config even exists in the first place. And the TLDR is basically there is something needed in the engine to connect stuff from P3D that's defined on the P3D, the names of like these selections down here, which can also consequently be bones themselves, which is an important concept. A selection can be a bone, and most likely it is. So like, how do bones interact? How do you name things to be seen in the config.cpp as well as the script C files? And so there's a lot of like hard-coded naming conventions that need to be followed. But the one that we're really interested in is the animation sources. So not all of these exist in Daisy, but a good amount of them do, and it's a really difference of just experimenting and seeing which ones work. But as you'll see, I use the source time, and here it's time-based input, basically making sure the animation is always running. But if you notice down here, there is also script-defined animations, or script-driven animations, and the source requires to be the user. And so sometimes this is a new modder mistake where they will copy somebody else's animation or model config, and they'll put it into their code and wonder why things aren't working in script. And this 9 times out of 10 is the reason why your script why you can't actually invoke your animation from your script. It's most likely this right here. And I'll make sure to post this documentation in the video, but it's important because I've used this to basically build my own animations from scratch. And so an important thing down here is the animation properties, where you can actually define the animation phase, the source of the animation, the axis it rotates around, the beginning and end oriented axes, the animation period, which is like the time it lasts. If you remember in like geometry class, you would have learned that a cosine or cosine and sine have periods of 1, or like the circle has a period of 1. And so it's just the time of your action. If you wanted to go shorter, you would reduce this value. If you wanted to go longer, you would increase its value. Min and max value are useful for like clamped animations. I'm not too versed in that, but angle 1, angle 2, offsets. This is useful for rotating or moving on a rotation on some axis. Okay, so basically that's a little bit about the documentation. And so how do we actually get it to start moving? So like, what do you actually need to make a scripted animation? Well, first off, you're going to need P3D, which we have. Second, you're going to need named selections that represent the thing you want to like interact with, or the thing that you want to actually move. And so if you'll notice, I have the console. We can ignore this selection for this example because this just represents the retexturable selection for my config.cpp. So we'll ignore that. Same with the buttons. It's just retextured selections. The important ones here are the CPU, the dial, power, relay, and server. Screen we can ignore because that's for emissives. But you'll notice that as I'm clicking on each of these selections, they are highlighting very specific vertices on the model. And the reason why we do this is because when the animation actually happens in the engine, we want to actually move the vertices visually. And so the only way to do that is to like differentiate them from the actual model. So this is step one, like make a selection in your P3D, define the vertices that you want to move. So if you're making a door, like this would be the handle, and that'd be that. And so you'll notice if I swap through my LODs, my levels of detail, I have the buttons existing for a few of them, but eventually you get far enough away that you don't really care what the animation of the button is. So it'll just revert back to the base model. And this is just a design choice. You can choose to push them all through all LODs. Do what makes you feel happy. Okay. Geometry. Some people will put, if you have a need for your animation to persist its collision, you would also draw boxes and components around those pieces. So like for a door, I would have several components here representing, the door, the frame, so that you could actually have space between the frames. You could walk through it, and then the handle. But for my example here, we're doing a simple one where the animations don't persist their collisions. It's just a switch on a console, so it's not here. We might touch on that later. We might do a door. If you're interested, Novo God did a lesson on doors in the Infusion Discord over here. So come in here, guys, a tutorial lesson on doors. He has several very complex examples of making doors and a couple easy ones as well to make it a learning experience. So check that out if you care. There's a lot of documentation around doors, so I'm not going to touch on them. Okay, moving on to the memory LOD. We have the second requirement, which is your animations need to know what they're gonna do and where the action starts, or where the action will be like triggered from. And this the underscore action selection for any given one of these switches is not necessarily required. It's useful to do checking inside of the action in the script world if you're like close enough to that memory point. And so this memory point has a position in local space and in world space. Your character has a position in world space, and you can compare those distances and check to see if you're close enough to the button to actually do stuff. This is how base building works. So I put it in there just in case, just to make sure that like you're at least a meter away from the button. You could technically do it to the whole console. Since I have multiple buttons, I like being explicit. That's just my personal preference. You'll also notice that there's an underscore axis. This axis is the, I want to say point, but it's the axis at which the selection right here will rotate around. So we look here, I select this switch, and then I go to my memory, you'll see that this point is right at the base, in the middle of the base of that selection. So I'm essentially telling the engine, hey, when you actually do a transform or a rotation, do it around this specific axis. And it's important because I can rotate on the Y, the Z, or the X, and make it look different. Okay. The third requirement, and the last requirement in the P3D, is the view geometry. And the reason why this is important is because this is what is actually triggered or is used for the action, script action. When the player is looking at the model, say you've made your own custom security bunker door, if you're looking at a model and you want to look at a specific button on the model, you need to have something in the view geometry differentiating that button from the rest of the box. And that's what you see here. Each switch has its own component. And I've also created a new selection and defined it around the component as well. And this is important because in the code, we can always just refer to component 02. And that's not a problem. However, when we come back to our mod after DayZ's updated in a year and we need to fix something, we'll wonder what the hell is component 02 or 03 or 04 in the code. And we'll have to go into the P3D to figure things out. Ideally, I like to name them this so that I can refer to them in the script as this selection. Okay, and also observe that the names are the same across LODs. So CPU is CPU in memory. In the view geometry, you can also see CPU here. Fire geometry is your normal fire geometry. That's for P3Ds. So that's it. So just as a recap and summary, you'll need a name selection in the level of detail with the vertices selected for each set of things that you want to rotate. In your memory LOD, you will need a axis to rotate around and a selection for triggering the action. And then in the view geometry, you'll need components defined for each individual component so that it can actually be viewable or triggered from script files. Okay. That's it. Nothing too complicated. If you've done any type of new model creation, you've already created a ZBY text selection, so that should be very familiar to you. The second part, which is a little bit harder, is the model config, and I apologize for the highlighting in VS Code. I haven't really found a good linter or a good schema for this, and so I'm gonna go and collapse that. First things first, when you're dealing with animations, to turn a selection into a bone, all you need to do is define it inside of a CFG selection. Excuse me, CFG skeletons class. All right. And so class CFG skeletons, this is defined by DayZ. This is what I would use, like a vanilla inherent. My class radio wall console, this is my custom named class that I've created. I could put a bunch of gibberish back here and it wouldn't really matter because it's my class. Is discrete. Does this model bend at its bones based on weights, or is it a rigid object? Since this is a switch that goes up and down, then it's discrete. They're rigid objects. I'm not inheriting any skeletons because I want my own custom one and I want to keep it nice and tight, nice and small. And then what are the skeleton bones inside of my skeleton? Well, if you notice, the names that are here are the names of our selections. And so I'm basically taking a selection, turning into a bone. And this is powerful because if you wanted to make other animations, or let's say as a custom zombie, and you're like, how do I make a skeleton for a zombie that I've created in Blender? Well, I mean, this is literally where you would define the bones that you created. And you might ask yourself, well, why is there a comma empty string after the bone name? And the reason why is because this bone doesn't connect to anything. However, in my first example, if I was trying to recreate my hand and my pinky, I would have 3 bones in my pinky. So let's go ahead and do something like that, where it'd be like pinky 1, and we know that that is attached to, the pinky 2, and pinky 2 is attached to pinky 3, and pinky 3 is really attached to palm 1, right? And then we'll just say that we're only talking about the hand. Palm 1 isn't attached to anything. And so this is how you would say, well, when pinky 3 moves, make sure you move pinky 2, and then when pinky 2 moves, make sure you move pinky 1. And if you think about that for a second and recognize how powerful that connection is, you can essentially begin to brainstorm how to build your own mounted turrets on top of vehicles, because all that really is a bone connected to a vehicle on top of a swizzle. So it's like 3 bones in series, which you could rotate all at once or not. This is basically how you do it. But for our intents and purposes, I've created 1 bone for each selection that I want to move. All right. And if you were watching the video, you can go back and compare these names to the names in the P3D. I'll spoil it. They are the same. Okay. So my skeleton is created. Let's go talk about the model definition. And so, again, if you've made your own P3Ds, this is very familiar. And this shouldn't feel uncommon. I've created a class which represents my my P3D, sorry, and I've defined the skeleton name. I have defined the sections that exist that can be retextured. You notice these are the other sections in the P3D. The more important part is the animations. The animation definition is probably something you haven't created yet. And if we go back to our documentation, here we go. You'll notice that the definition that you see here is pretty much the same as what's in the docs. And so if you're like trying to build your own or copying from Macaro's Eliteness, like just make sure that you are mindfully putting the values in. And so, you know, you have the type, which is what is the type of animation. In my case, I'm rotating. I want to rotate. You could translate or scale. And then for showing that the animation works, I put the source in as the time, but I technically want the user to be able to trigger this animation. Otherwise, I won't be able to interact with it on the script side. Source address is important. There are 3 values that you can have. Basically, does the animation loop or not? You can have clamp, which is the default. There's loop, which is looping, and mirror, which is a mirror of your initial values and period and animation period, which is what I'm using because it's switching on and off. I don't need to control the reset animation. I just need it to traverse back the path it went, and mirror is very excellent for that. The selection, when the animation is played, what selection of vertices should the animation apply to? This is important. This is one of the ways where you connect your animation to the model, to the P3D. Okay, so it's important because sometimes you will copy and paste someone else's animation and you'll get the selection wrong because you've renamed your own P3D. This is another area where it can cause a new modder headache. The axis, what axis are we rotating around? You saw in the P3D, it was just a single point in space positioned where I want things to rotate around. I could technically go rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z. By default, it rotates on X, so I just use rotation. Probably bad form if they ever change something in the future, but not really important. Memory is a default value is 1. If you don't provide that, it'll just put it in there for you, so you don't have to worry about it. The min value and the max value, this is our animation period, right? Yeah. Basically, what value can the animation phase be at minimum and maximum? And this is important because this controls the length or duration of the animation. Some people might be asking themselves, how do I make my animation faster? Or how do I make it not last so long? Well, this is how you do it. Any value above 1 will get clamped to 1. Any value below 0 will get clamped to 0. And this is if the source address is clamp. It's another important thing. Since I'm using mirror, most likely my animation phase is always increasing. But due to the magic of -1, I can just inverse my number once it gets to max. So it probably just bounces between these 2 values. Angle 0 and angle 1, these are only seen if you are using rotations. So you might notice that I'm not using offset. And that's because I'm not using translations. I'm just using rotations. So if you were to be moving this up and down instead of rotating it left and right, you would want to use offset 0, offset 1. That's another important distinction. Okay, so that's it for the model config. I have 1 of each for each button, and then 1 for the dial, because I want each one to be able to rotate individually. Technically, you could have a single selection apply to many vertices and have them all rotate and animate at once. In this case, I wanted them to be all independent. Okay, so that's major file number 2 done. Okay, now we need to actually create the config.cpp for the item. More or less, I need to create the item for the world. Right, and so this should become a little bit more familiar to people that do retextures and stuff. You've made your CFG patches. You have predefined classes for the retextured items, and you've actually copy and pasted people's hidden selections and hidden selection textures and set them to your own. And so again, this should look very familiar. My model is the model of the wall console. You'll notice that I'm using a static object, and that's because personally this specific item is going to be a static object in the world, and that's just what I needed. You could use item base or anything else if you wanted, and use scope 2. So that wouldn't have an issue. The important part here, though, is the animation sources defined inside of the item. And you'll notice that, again, the names are the same. Encasing is the same as well. Again, very important to be mindful of. And this probably here is the least amount of code, because really all we're doing is saying, hey, this item has animation sources, so look inside the model config. And those specific things that you should be looking for are named relay, server, CPU, power, dial, and the way you interact with them is user. The animation period that we're going to use for this specific item is half of what's defined in the model config. And our init phase, the phase in which we start, is going to be 0. So I could technically have these things start in the on setting or in the on position. Because if you think about going from 0 to 1, with fractions, we have many different steps in between, and so I could technically stop the button halfway if I wanted to. And actually, let's go ahead and let's see if we can even do that. All right. And so by this point, we would have an animatable item to put into the game. And in fact, I'm gonna back these out and go back to time for that, and I'm gonna show at this point that animations would be set up without user input, just by using time, and then we'll swap it to user and show the actions that are needed to actually interact with the object. Let me go to my folders. Getting into my go start the server. If it has no issues, I'll start the client. Also, while this is starting up, some people might find the process or the layout that I did a little cumbersome, but personally I find trying to get my animations to be seen or verified as soon as possible is important. That's one reason why I put the model config to time and then opened it up in Bulldozer, because if my animations don't work in Bulldozer, they're definitely not going to work in game. And then I won't know if it's the code that I wrote or my configs that I wrote or the model animation. So that's one reason why I kind of laid it out the way I did. I feel it's best to start with the P3D and the model config, do Bulldozer verification, then build the config CPP, put the item in the game, make sure it's actually animating in game, and then add the action on top of it. Kind of a duplicated work a little bit, but it really makes it easy when you make a mistake. Oh no. Okay, yeah. So you heard me lamenting there for a second because things aren't animating, and that's because my all of my settings are turned down. And so this is something as an animator you have to keep in mind when you're testing your animations. This is something that's bit me in the butt a couple times. I'm wondering why I'm not able to see stuff, and it's because my settings are so low. So this is due to the LOD, the levels of details being changed, and it only works if I'm like right up on it, which is okay because really when you're interacting with something, you're really looking at the first LOD anyway. So as you can see, the animations of the switches are doing what we want, and this tells me that everything is hooked up correctly. So as soon as I turn this to the user, if I'm not able to flip the switch, it's something in the code side and not the animation side. It's just good feedback loop. I know we're on the right track. Okay. Let's go ahead and put these back to the user. I can close that file because I don't need it anymore. And close the model config because we don't need it anymore. And alrighty. So what we do need is we will need an action to flip the switch on, right? We need something for the user to get a prompt, something that triggers the user to prompt to do something. And most of us have probably played on servers where there's a door that you can interact with. And so I basically went to the door, action, open door, right? Oh, it's open doors. And I basically copied this as my template. And I deleted a bunch of stuff, but basically, I'm using action interact base. I'm using the command UID for open doors. I'm using the same stance mask, and I've just renamed the text. So for those that are following along the video, this is basically what I did. I took action open doors. Okay. And I added my action to the constructor of actions. If you've done recipes before, this should be pretty familiar. I'm not going to go over this in this video. I also added the action to the player. Since I don't require an item in the hands to do this thing, you need to add the action to the player instead of an item. And the override set actions is a bit different for a player than an item because there's an input map. Just know that. So go to the player base, copy it, just like you would a normal action. Okay. So in terms of the condition item, there's no item that's expected in my hands, and my target will be my cursor. So on that note, I'll go and collapse this for a second. My action condition, I can't always expect to have a target, and so I'm checking to see, like, if I don't have a target, return false. If the thing that I'm looking at isn't a building, return false. If we don't have a player, return false. And if it's not within reach, return false. And so just some guardrails on our action that kind of quickly filter out things, sort of our half step, hopefully a log n type approach. It's most things, if I don't have a target, this is just going to short circuit out. But once I get past those, I basically say, hey, get the object that we're looking at and cast it to my wall console. Great. We now have a reference to our wall console that we're looking at, which is important because I like to encapsulate a lot of my behavior into the class or the object that we're dealing with. And so one thing to note, and this is important, another gotcha for new modders, is that the server and client run an action condition at different intervals. And this is important because the server checks once when you click the action, whereas a client does it on frame. And so another caveat to this is the server doesn't necessarily know exactly which components you are looking at, mainly because a lot of things are rendered client side. And so there's just some things that don't exist on the server from a client perspective, like what component am I looking at? Or where is my client cursor pointed at on a model? Like I know the specific vectors, I don't know the specific names. That information just isn't synced. So the way we get around that is basically by saying, from my perspective, the server really only cares about if we're looking at the console to be doing its checking. So if at any time my character or player is looking at a console, I basically say, yeah, from the server side, you're good to go. The action's great. Whereas on the client, I check to see, are you looking at the relay selection? Are you looking at the server selection? Are you looking at the CPU or power selection? And so this is one reason why I gave them actual names so that I can do this. Because now when I read the code a year later, oh, I know that I'm looking at specific parts of my wall console. And I know exactly which ones. So this is important. And then if you're not looking at those things, just return false. So basically this is making sure that I'm looking at the right thing. Now, you'll notice that when we were in game and I hovered over each switch, the name of the action changed. And I'm doing that by hooking into the native vanilla function on action info update. And basically it's the same method signature as action condition. I have access to the player, the target, and the item base. And so I basically say, hey, what are you looking at? And modify the name that's seen by the component that you're looking at. And so this is a really nice, easy way of swapping an action's name out in real time based on what you're looking at, what the player is, and some stuff about the target. And it's low-hanging fruit. This is just natively run on every update. So as long as your logic isn't too heavy, this is a pretty innocuous setup and change. Okay, so basically we have a condition that says if I'm looking at a switch on my wall console, return true, otherwise return false. Make sure you display the name of the switch whenever you are looking at it. And then lastly, we need to actually do something, do the animation, or do the work that does the animation. And so on end server, when the action is ended on the server, I say get the console we're looking at. And then again, I check to see, are you looking at the specific part that you should be, relay, server, CPU, or power? And if you are, then toggle that button and set sync dirty. And so the server controls the state of the console, and the client is updated through net syncing. This is important because if I didn't have this, a player could toggle the animation, but it would only toggle for them. And then another player would come into the zone, and they would try to toggle the thing, and it wouldn't toggle for them because the state is already at a different state, and I don't have any way of updating the animation on my own client. And so I've laid it out this way because I've built code already around this to essentially do the toggle. And that's basically it. So our action is very, very light, and for those watching on the video, it's important, in my opinion, to keep your actions very small like this. And this is a consequence or a result, whatever you want to call it, of encapsulation. My action doesn't really know anything about the wall console. It just says do the thing you're looking at. It's where instead I could have put all the code in here, but it would have bloated it. So let's look at the wall console. What does the wall console actually do? Okay. Well, the wall console has a couple properties, a couple booleans. It can be powered on, it's on or off. The CPU can be on or off. It can be connected to the server that switches on or off. And then the relay could be on or off. And then there's a dial that has 5 different states. It could be 0 through 4. And in order to ensure that I can net sync to other people, I register the net syncs when the console's created. And since this is a static one object, it's spawned it on server start, essentially. You might be asking yourself, for the register net sync variable int, why do I have these 2 values at the end? And if you are doing anything other than booleans, it's good to have clamps on your variables, because integers can be 32 bits large. And when we are net syncing information, we are essentially trying to shove data into a 32-bit int by cleverly masking data. And so if I were just to leave this dial setting as a full 32-bit int, I would be essentially taking up much more space than I would having to represent, the number 4, which is 3 bits technically. Right? Yeah, it'd be 1 1. No, it'd just be 0 0 1, something like that. So it's important to clamp your ints. This keeps your network traffic small, and it keeps it so that you don't lag the server. Because the larger your NetSync payload gets, the slower NetSyncs become, and they'll stack up and cause issues. So keep that in mind. Okay. So I'm going to crawl down this function. There are a bunch of helpers here. I'm an old school programmer. I like getters and setters. I like protected variables so that you can't touch them directly. This just enforces a specific pattern of getting from a single place. My source comes from a single place. So that's just what you see down here. It's kind of scaffolding. You can ignore that. You might have noticed the toggle information or the toggle action in the flip switch. And here I am just using my setters. I say set the value to the inverse of the Boolean. So I'm just using single one-line Boolean inversing here. I could technically say bool new bool equals well, I would probably just say, you could actually do a couple ways. I could say something like if m.is relay connected set is relay connected to true, else is relay connected to false. And this, in my opinion, is when I see something like this, this shows me a scripter is self-taught or is new in their programming journey, or doesn't have like a classical programming education. And the reason why I say that is because we're essentially duplicating our intent. We basically say, if I were to read this in plain English, if true, set relay connected true. Otherwise, if false, set the relay connected to false. And so when I say it through English, you can hear the duplication on it, right? I'm basically this variable that represents my Boolean state is either true or false, and we're checking its conditionality. If it's true, then I'm setting it to a static value true. I could technically just basically say, get rid of the if condition and just set the result to the Boolean condition. Perfect. But at this point, I'm basically saying, if this value was true, I would always be setting it to true. And so I can use inverse the bang or the exclamation mark to flip the Boolean to false. So if this was true, that'd be false. If it was false, it would be true. So it's a simple one-liner there, sort of explained. And so if I put these files side by side, it kind of feels like magic given how simple it looks, but it really is this simple, okay? If I'm looking at the selection in the model that I just made, take the object that it represents and call the function to toggle the relay. Inside my relay, I change the Boolean to be inverse from itself, and then I set sync dirty. And that set sync dirty then flags this model to call on variable synchronized in the client with the new value. And that's important because when the client gets synchronized, I can then update the visuals. And so you see here, I've kind of pulled it out into 4 separate functions. Again, I could have combined it all in one, but it makes it easier to understand what's going on when they're all separate. And so if I just look at the power switch, all right, I get my getter, is power on? And if it is, I set the animation phase of the selection of the animation of the bone that we all defined earlier to 1, and between 0 and 1, on or off. And this is what will trigger the animation. This one line of code right here. This is what does the work. All right. And so everything that we've been doing has been leading up to writing this line of code and then calling it at the specific time. And so this would be new modder error number, like new modder error number 4 or whatever. Not actually calling this function or calling it incorrectly, starting off at 0 and then calling 1, or calling it on the server and not the client. And so hopefully I sort of laid it out in a sequential order of the way it needs to be, called and the way it needs to be defined, essentially. And so if I open these other ones up, they're basically just duplicates of this one with the different selection being called. Okay. So if we put it all together, I build this again because I've changed the animations. You will be able to see that really there's very little code involved in making your own scriptable animations. This requires a few specific milestones. This also works for vanilla things as well. So if you think about containers that open and close, this set animation phase, if I were to search vanilla, all right, well, that's car doors. Those are always so difficult. Here's an alarm clock. So the alarm clock does the same thing. You set the animation and it will begin rotating the ticker timer. And the set animation phase now says do it now. Sometimes you'll see with mine, it interpolates or it smoothly moves to the next animation. You could technically just force it to go back up. Some people like that. All right, so we're here. You can see my action, flip, switch, power. There's the relay, the server, the CPU, and then if I do power, and you can see that it user's able to trigger the action up and down. This is basically like a door. And yeah, that's it. Pretty simple. Or at least hopefully it looks pretty simple. And they're all independent. That's it. If we look at Daisy doors. Doors on building basically has the same heck happened. Sorry. It kind of goes over the same information, but from a door perspective, which hook into vanilla actions and map-based buildings. And so there are a couple more considerations, and I won't really go over them here because Nova God put a really good explanation together. We'll maybe talk about them on another day, but basically, it kind of has the same information. You need name selections in the respective LODs. For our case, we didn't have colliding geometries, so we didn't need to put it in the geo or the fire geometry. We need memory LOD vertices to define the axis of rotation, or where the sound should be played and where the widget itself should be displayed. And then lastly, for a house or for like a map-based building that you want to have collision, you would need this class house in here. That way the game knows to sort of use your mesh. And then you can see that they've outlined dimensions for doors, which is very nice for Blender stuff. If you notice here for the model config, it has essentially told us the same thing that I went over. You need your class CFG skeletons, defaults, whatever. It's just a way of creating a hierarchical structure of inheritance. The most important thing here are the skeletons, or the bones, which are the selections. And then the CFG model of your model with the animations defined. And you can see here that for doors, the naming for door 1 and door 2, that's like specific for doors so that like the map will remember them. and save its state as the server restarts. So if you're making a house or making doors, you need to use the same naming convention. You can't just use something new, otherwise you'll run into problems. And fortunately for you, they've done all the hard work, which is how wide should a door open, and what should your access be, where should the source be. It's really just copy and paste. Again, here's a nice explanation of them. The game config for a door versus an item like we did, you can kind of see ours was more or less the same. They use land underscore, but for a door, instead of animation sources, you use class doors. Again, this is how the game itself maps the state of a door to be remembered in the database. So you can also kind of get into trouble, I believe, if you change the number of doors in a model after you spawned it. So if you're a new modder and you have to like wipe your database because of that, just be wary. Okay, these sound open, closed, locked a bit, open a bit. If you look inside of vanilla files, they have their own OGGs defined for these, but you can technically make them whatever you want. It's just a sound set. And the damage system can be ignored. A little bit of definitions about those things that we talked about in the video today. Special cases for double doors and shifting doors. So if you notice the barns or the warehouses, instead of opening outwards, they slide left and right like a Asian door. So they kind of call out here, use a translation instead of rotation, because otherwise he'll get issues. And then here's a thing about raycasting, but I'm not going to go into it. And then the nice thing here is there's a sample for doors. So that's it. That's animations in a nutshell. I'm surprised I was able to get in under an hour. Nice. Questions, comments, concerns? How you doing, Genry? No comments? Word. All right. Well, in that case, then I'll go ahead and we'll close it down and call it a day. I think next time next week we'll work on the radial menu. I've seen a couple of people ask for it. Radial menu like this. They're easier than you would think, but there are a couple gotchas that kind of suck. Oh, that's what you wanted? Shit. Here. Well, I can do a TLDR. I think a TLDR that you would understand. Okay. So let's do... Where's my radio? Dynamic radio range. Okay. So I built a mod that showcased... Let's go into workshop. Dynamic radio ranges, where it allows you to bring up a radial menu that brings up categories, and then there are different specific selections inside of the categories. And this was an interesting experiment into an already, I guess, looked at field. Like, I've already done radio menus before, but I did them once and I wasn't sure if I fully understood them. And so this was a way for me to recap my knowledge. So let's talk about what you need for the radial menu. Okay, let me get some of these files open here. Don't think I need... Oh yeah, I'll need this one. I'll need the action to bring up the radio. And then I need the menu. This. And then I need the GUI. Okay. All right, here we go. To make a radial menu, you need a few things. First off, you will need an RPC, which represents a player accessing the menu, because the player is going to make a selection on their client side, and we need to be able to send that data to the server. That's like big caveat number one, right? The connection between client selection to server, because the server is actually the thing that needs to do the work, and the client really just needs to tell the server what it selected. So RPC from client to server when I make the selection, and just keep that in the back of your mind. We will also need a constant integer which represents the ID of the radial menu. So as Daisy manages menus and creates them, it assigns them an ID, and in this case our ID is 97. Probably important to have a unique ID. That's one reason why I picked one that's like 3 times a vanilla one. So hopefully I don't collide with anyone else. Okay. So moving forward, let's talk about the specific radial menu itself. You don't necessarily need an enum that represents radial menu categories, but I do it just because I like it better than -1 being floating around in my code. And so this is a copy of vanilla. And then my categories just represent, in this case, they are the ranges of my radio, or they are the categories of face paint in my face paint mod. Those are dynamically generated, and so I don't have them defined here. But if yours are static, then you can define them here, and that's fine. There is a class which represents a specific radial item in the wheel. And so here I have an ID which represents the ordinal index, 0 through count, the name of the radial menu item, so the thing that's actually printed, category, so it knows what category it's under, and then the actual widget and item card. These are just, this is all copy paste. And I'm just using it. And so, and the reason why it's copy and paste is because there's no generic radial menu class. There is an emote, or there's a gesture menu item and a gesture wheel, and it's all based around the gestures. And so I've had to kind of recreate it from scratch, and there's no gesture wheel framework yet. I was thinking about making one, but I'm not sure if it's needed. If you say it's needed, I could definitely make one, but basically you just have to copy the classes and make the new ones. Okay, so I have my category, I have my item. Now I need to actually construct my radial menu, because really a radial menu is just a bunch of radial items. Some are categories, some are items, and they're just nested that way. So I copied vanilla and I pasted, and I did a lot of renaming, but I also removed a lot of stuff that I don't need. And I will go ahead and link you, Genry, a link to this repository so you can actually like have a reference, so you don't have to copy and paste what you're seeing. There you go. Okay. So rolling down through here, you know, a lot of these things aren't really important. Like this is the UI, the list of actual radial items, right? The toolbar, the category name text, some constants that link into the layout, because I'm using vanilla layout. I'm not actually making my new one. You'll see a lot of existing workshop mods use or change the layout. In my opinion, that's not the way it should be. You should just be able to add a new thing into it. So anyway, clean up, or when we construct the object, make a new list of radial menus. So basically when I press the period button to bring up my gesture menu, this code is run. So, you know, make a new list of menu items and populate the list. It's a singleton essentially. When it goes away, get rid of the the input excludes. This is important so that the player can actually do stuff. Menus block input, so you want to remove that block. Okay, important thing here, when we open menu, we are entering a scripted menu with the constant we created. So essentially we tell the game, hey, game, create a new UI with our menu ID. And so this will trigger to the rest of the game, hey, there's a menu that's open. And you know, don't let other menus up, or when you want to get a reference to the menu, like this is the ID for it. Closing the menu is using the back function, so nothing new there. Widget init. All I'm doing here is copying vanilla and renaming the value or the function here, because it was gesture menu and I just do radial options. So nothing new there. On show is copy paste, on hide is copy paste, on controller copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. The update I changed because I liked why did I do that? I think it's because I simplified the logic. Gesture. Okay, cool. Here. Oh yeah. Sorry. I changed it because I needed to do the different categories. This is what I was talking about. I didn't like the -1 just floating here. And I probably should change that too. But I mean, that's up to personal preference. Let's see, gestures. Okay, so here's the meat that you're probably looking for. Okay, the things that actually changed. Refresh radial options, and so in the gesture menu, this is probably refresh gesture options. And so basically, anytime you press the menu or press the hotkey to bring up your gestures or your menu, it will recalculate what should be shown based on the category that's selected. And so if you're bringing the menu up for the first time, right, the default is -1, which is the category set. So the list of options available. These things. And then otherwise, so sorry, basically if the category is something other than 1, it's going to populate it with the values. And so for this example, it would be, oh, I selected 2000, so I can see all the values within 1000 to 2000. Great. Otherwise, it's the category -1, so show the vanilla menu. Basically, show the vanilla options, and then create the gesture content, which is actually build it, the UI elements. If I were to go down here, you can see I'm deleting the existing menu items, and I'm going through the list of all radio items, and I'm making a new widget. I'm populating it with the ID and item, set the values. So that's a vanilla function that I've just changed a little bit. And then the get gesture items. And so this is the thing that actually populates the lists. And so for my range, when the category is the categories, I basically say what's the min and max and loop through each one. So I go from 1 to 17, and then I put a kilometer at the end of it. But if it's not a category and it's a selection, then I say, okay, well, what selection is it? Build the steps, and then this one line here is basically shove the new radial menu item in. And that's it. That's literally it. Well, that's building the menu. And then I'll collapse all this crap because, again, these are all copy and paste. You'll notice that these are all voids and not overrides. It's because, again, this is a new class. It doesn't exist. So I'm building it. Okay. So now, what happens when a user clicks on a category? Okay. We need a way of hooking into that like invoke function. And that's what we're seeing here, the execute selected. So I have two functions here. One is for the category. So if I click a category, I basically tell it to rebuild the contents with a new list of items. If I click a specific item, this is where the magic happens. Why didn't I hear it from the original? Because there is no original. The gesture menu is a UI scripted menu. There's no like radial menu generic class, unfortunately. And so that's what I was saying earlier. I was thinking of making a framework for it, like a mod that you can just put on the workshop, and it would just have this little UI widget. You would pass it a list of categories, strings or whatever, pass it, or maybe probably just pass it a map, a string list of objects, list of things, and have it just populate from that from a hotkey or action that you care about. But I wasn't sure if that's like overkill or if people would even use it. Do you think that's useful? Well, the gesture menu exists, but it's heavily hard-coded. Like, heavily hard-coded. When I first did the face paints, I did just use this, and it became prohibitive in its extensibility. But honestly, it's been so long. If you find a way to override and use it, I would be very happy to see if it can be done. Because you know me, I hate having to rewrite code. I don't know you. You know my coding style. Anyway, the magic. So earlier you heard me say that there was a need to RPC the data from client to server. And this is where that happens, right here. And so just decomposing this. You got the rest? Nice. Yeah, I mean, at this point it's RPC the data to the server, and then the server tells the client what it needs to do from this thing. Just like a gesture. The client says, "Hey, I wanna dance," and then the server says, "Okay, well, you can dance and run this emo." Cool. That's good stuff. Everything else is extra. It's really just like 3 or 4 functions that you got to override there. Oh, and then there's the actual for sake of video, there's actually like invoking the menu. Like when I mentioned when you create a menu, the ID is set so that other things can do it. That happens in mission base. You can see that we're creating our menu here, and then in mission gameplay, in the on update, basically if our menu is showing, like make sure that you're excluding things. So it's kind of boilerplate. Probably really needs the UI global update. Yeah, you can tell it was definitely one of the newer or one of the older parts of their game. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything specific? Otherwise, I'll close up the video. Awesome. Well, hope you have a good day. And for the video, thanks everyone for watching. Have a great day. See you next week.